Okay, let's jump right into the sources you've shared with us for this deep dive. We're tackling a really fascinating and frankly intense moment in Japanese history. The 1918 rice riots.
That's right. And this wasn't just, a small protest. It was a series of massive, widespread social upheavals ignited by one fundamental problem: the price of rice becoming completely unaffordable for ordinary people.
And our goal today is to use these sources as our guide to really unpack why this happened, how it spiraled out of control, who was caught up in it, and the genuinely surprising consequences it had for Japan.
Exactly. Think of this as cutting through the noise to get the essential insights directly from the material you've brought us.
So to understand the explosion, we first need to set the scene. What was Japan like back then in 1918?
Well, 1918 falls within the Taishō era, and Japan was in a period of pretty significant economic change. A major factor was World War I, which was raging elsewhere, but creating this boom for Japanese industries, increased demand.
The Taishō era boom sounds positive on the surface.
It did, yeah. But it had this downside related to food, which the sources highlight. While industrial areas were booming, you had big shifts happening. More people were moving from farms into cities for factory jobs.
Right.
And that led to increased rice consumption in the cities, but fewer people were left in the countryside actually producing it.
So a classic scenario, really.
Yeah.
Demand going up while supply struggles to keep pace. Yet the sources note there was a period of stability first.
Yes, surprisingly, rice prices had been relatively stable for about 3.5 years after the war began in 1914. The real crisis point where prices just exploded, well, that hit around the middle of 1918.
And that sudden spike in price is the core trigger for everything that followed, isn't it? Why did rice become so incredibly expensive so fast?
Well, the sources point to a kind of perfect storm of factors converging. One significant element was a decrease in rice imports.
Okay.
And here's where a government foreign policy decision plays a role. The Siberian Intervention, which Japan announced on August 2nd, 1918, that affected shipping and, availability.
So a decision on the international stage had this direct, really painful impact on families trying to put food on the table back home.
Exactly. And what else was driving the cost up? Critically, the sources emphasize rampant speculation and deliberate withholding of rice.
Hoarding.
Yes. Landowners, dealers, they saw the writing on the wall. They were anticipating continued high demand, partly fueled by the war and the Siberian Intervention, and they decided to hoard their stock. They were sort of betting prices would go even higher, and they were actively manipulating the market.
This is where the numbers really make it hit home, I think. What kind of price jumps are we talking about according to the sources?
The increases are, they're astonishing. The price per koku, that's a large volume unit, about 150 kilograms in Osaka, soared from around 15 yen in January 1918 to over 50 yen by August 9th.
Wow, more than tripling in just over 6 months.
Yeah. And the price people actually paid at the market, the retail price per show, that's a much smaller unit, maybe 1.8 liters, what you'd buy for daily cooking, that went from roughly 34 sen to over 60 sen in the same period.
Okay, let's put that 60 sen per show into the context of daily life. What was a typical laborer earning then?
The sources note a typical laborer's monthly wage was only about 18 to 25 yen. So yeah, paying 60 sen or 0.6 yen for just one show of rice. I mean, that was a massive, unsustainable portion of their tiny income just going to their most basic food staple.
So you have this explosive price increase driven by international events and domestic manipulation, just crushing ordinary households. What did the government, the Taishō cabinet, do about it?
Well, the sources describe their attempts, but I think the clear takeaway is that they were largely ineffective or just insufficient to tackle the scale of the crisis.
Did they try to stop the hoarding you mentioned?
They did. They enacted something called the Profiteering Control Order. Its intent, was specifically to clamp down on hoarding and the deliberate withholding of essential goods like rice.
And did it work?
The source states directly that it had no effect. Basically, the market manipulation just continued.
Okay, so controlling profiteering failed. What about increasing supply? Did they try that?
Yes, they also implemented the Foreign Rice Management Order, and they designated companies like Mitsui and Suzuki Shoten to import rice from overseas. But again, the sources tell us, prices just did not fall as a result of these efforts.
So their main economic tools failed to really impact the market. What about direct help for the people struggling to eat? Any relief?
This is another critical point from the sources. The budget allocated for relief projects was minimal, just 35,000 yen for a nationwide crisis affecting millions. I mean, it was nowhere near enough.
And instead of effective relief or price control, What did they focus on? What was their main response?
Well, the sources note their primary visible response was, increasing police presence to try and manage the growing public discontent.
Which probably didn't help things.
No, the consequence of this, according to the sources, was simply fueling resentment, specifically directed at the rice dealers and capital owners who were seen as profiting from the crisis while everyone else suffered.
It sounds like tension was just building immensely with the economic hardship and the government's perceived failure. What was the specific spark that finally ignited the widespread protests?
For a long time, the traditional story, pointed to July 22nd in Uozu, Toyama Prefecture. The narrative usually focused on fishermen's wives protesting rice shipments at the port there.
Right, that's the version you often hear.
It is, but one key insight from the sources you provided is the newer academic research that suggests the initial actions might have happened earlier than that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, this research points to women porters in Higashi Mizuhashi, also in Toyama, who were apparently already demanding an export merchant stop shipping rice in early July.
That shifts the timeline a bit. And does this research tell us more about who was involved in those very first protests? Was it just fishermen's families?
It definitely broadens our understanding beyond just fishermen's wives. The sources indicate these early participants included families of shipping and stevedore workers, people closely tied to the labor communities around the ports. The term urban fishermen is even used, suggesting, early non-agricultural wage laborers. It connects the protests to these emerging working-class communities.
That suggests the rice crisis wasn't happening in a vacuum, but perhaps intersected with existing labor tensions or poor conditions.
Precisely. Yeah, the sources even reference a prior incident back in April-May at Harima Shipyard where workers, already frustrated by poor conditions and food prices, actually attacked facilities. This backdrop of existing labor unrest is really crucial for understanding why these communities were among the first to take action when rice prices became unbearable.
Okay, so once that initial spark happened in Toyama, how did the protests develop there? Did they stay peaceful?
In Toyama, it began as, desperate appeals for aid and demands for cheap rice sales. But as frustration mounted, it quickly escalated from just appeals to direct physical action.
What did that direct action look like?
People started gathering in large numbers, first hundreds and soon over 1,000. They would physically block rice exports from the ports. And they actually forced rice dealers to sell rice at significantly reduced prices, for instance, selling at 35 cents per show when the market price was maybe 40, 50 cents.
So ordinary people felt they had no choice but to intervene directly just to get access to affordable food. And this tactic of forcing prices down, I imagine word got out. It didn't stay contained in Toyama, did it?
Not at all. The news and the idea that you could actually take action and get cheaper rice, it spread incredibly fast. The sources show the movement jumping rapidly from city to city, hitting major urban centers like Kyoto and Nagoya around August 10th.
And did the nature of the protests change as they spread?
They did evolve, yes. The demands started with stopping exports and forcing cheap sales, but they escalated to demanding donations of rice or money. And then came acts of physical destruction, referred to as uchikawashi.
Uchikawashi.
Yeah, literally smashing or destroying the property of rice shops and other businesses perceived as responsible for the crisis. Things got violent.
Let's look at some specific cities mentioned in the sources. What happened in Kyoto?
The riots there began in the Yanagihara district, and the sources point out this was a large buraku area, which is significant. Protesters destroyed rice shops and forced sales at an even lower price than seen in Toyama, just 30 cents per show.
Okay. What about major commercial centers like Osaka and Kobe?
A really striking event mentioned is the burning of the Suzuki Shoten headquarters in Kobe on August 12th. This huge commercial firm became a major target, reportedly fueled by a false newspaper report accusing them of hoarding rice. It shows how misinformation could play a role in directing the crowd's anger.
That highlights the volatility of the situation, doesn't it? And Tokyo, the capital, how did it unfold there?
Tokyo was initially a bit slower to erupt, particularly from, say, organized political groups. But a planned outdoor speech meeting on August 13th in Hibiya Park, despite being prohibited by police, attracted thousands of people.
And that gathering became the catalyst.
Yes. There was a confrontation with the police. The crowd then fragmented and went through the city, attacking police boxes, throwing stones at commercial buildings, destroying vehicles. One notable target the sources mention was the Yoshiwara red light district, which was attacked and even set on fire.
Wow, a really wide range of targets for the crowd's anger there.
Definitely. They also conducted forced cheap rice sales in areas like Asakusa and Honjo. The military had to be deployed on August 15th and managed to suppress the rioting by the 16th. One key insight the sources highlight about Tokyo, though, is that compared to other areas, the Tokyo riots had this stronger anti-bourgeois character, and participants were often young men.
So the movement started in coastal towns, swept through the major cities like Kyoto, Kobe, Tokyo, and then, according to the sources, it reached another key area.
Yes, it spread inland and westward, reaching the coal mining areas in western Japan, places like Yamaguchi, Fukuoka, and Kumamoto by late August.
Were the protests there solely about rice prices as well, or were other factors involved?
Well, the skyrocketing rice price was definitely the immediate trigger, but in these mining regions, the unrest was often deeply connected to, existing wage disputes and really brutal living conditions that the high cost of rice simply made intolerable. It was the last straw.
The sources mentioned a particularly grim incident in Ube, Yamaguchi. Can you describe that?
Yes, on August 17th in Ube, about 3,000 miners attacked homes and businesses after their wage negotiations broke down completely. The military intervened the next day, and the result was tragic. 13 deaths among the miners.
13 deaths.
And here's a truly critical takeaway from the sources about the suppression in these mining areas. The military's justification for using lethal force, their claim that the miners used dynamite, well, it appears, according to later research cited in the sources, to have been fabricated to justify their actions.
Fabricated justification for shooting people. That's a stunning insight from the research.
It is. And the sources go on to discuss similar situations in the Fukuoka and Kumamoto coal mines, referencing contradictory accounts about dynamite use, particularly around the Manechi coal mine incident. They explicitly cite research indicating the military likely fabricated accounts there as well to justify shooting miners.
So the artwork we sometimes see depicting miners throwing dynamite, like Sakubi Yamamoto's famous pieces.
According to the sources, that artwork, at least regarding specific incidents like Maneki, seems to have been based on hearsay, not, direct observation of those events. It might reflect the rumors or the official story rather than the reality.
That's important context.
And the sources also mention other instances of violence during suppression, like a miner being stabbed to death by a soldier while simply trying to escape after being arrested for attending a prohibited gathering, just trying to run away.
These details paint a really stark picture of the military's response in those areas. Were there other significant mine-related incidents?
Yes, few tests on August 27th where demands for price cuts and wage increases led to police and military suppression and one fatality. And Mike on September 4th, with similar demands leading to military suppression the next day, the protests in the mining areas stretched the unrest out, and overall, the rice riots continued for about 50 days.
Looking at the overall picture then, how massive was this uprising? Just how widespread did it get?
The scale is, immense. The sources tell us it reached 369 locations across almost every prefecture in Japan, 1 Hokkaido, 3 urban prefectures, 37 rural ones, and the estimated number of participants was in the millions.
Millions of people protesting across the nation. How did the government ultimately bring this under control?
Well, their response was essentially overwhelming force. Over 100,000 troops were deployed, including both Army soldiers and Navy Marines.
And there were significant casualties resulting from this military intervention.
Yes, the sources confirmed deaths resulted directly from the suppression, notably in places like Ube, as we discussed, and also Kobe, where Navy Marines were involved.
Were there any surprising details about the response from within the authorities themselves? Any dissent or unexpected actions?
Yeah, actually. One detail the sources mention is that some police officers in certain areas seem to have tacitly allowed the riots to continue, maybe out of sympathy or just being overwhelmed. And perhaps even more surprisingly, some sailors from the Navy were actually arrested for participating in the riots themselves.
That suggests not everyone in uniform was necessarily aligned against the protesters.
Interesting. What was the legal aftermath for those who were caught up in the riots?
The numbers are huge.
Yeah.
Over 25,000 people were arrested. Of those, 8,253 were sent for prosecution, and ultimately 7,786 were actually indicted.
And the sentences handed down.
They were very severe. In the initial trials, 12 people were given life sentences, and 59 received long prison terms of 10 years or more.
Life sentences.
Yes. And the sources highlight the most extreme punishments. 2 men in Wakayama were sentenced to death. It's noted there wasn't a single obvious leader of the entire nationwide movement, but individuals were sentenced based on charges like incitement. The sources also bring up a really difficult but crucial point about discrimination in the context of the riots, and particularly their aftermath.
Yes, they do. It's a significant insight the sources provide. A disproportionate number of people arrested and prosecuted were from Burakumin communities, which faced severe historical discrimination in Japan. They made up over 10% of those sentenced, far, far exceeding their percentage of the general population at the time.
Why was that the case, according to the sources? What's the connection?
Well, the sources explain that these communities were often among the most economically vulnerable and thus among the greatest victims of the rice speculation and price hikes. The unbearable increases hit them incredibly hard, making them perhaps more likely to participate in protests fueled by that sheer hardship.
Are there specific examples of this connection highlighted in the sources?
Absolutely. The Kyoto riots, as we discussed, started in the Yanagihara Buraku area. The sources also state that in prefectures with large Buraku populations, something like 3 or 4 out of every 10 people arrested were Burakumin.
3 or 4 out of 10.
Yeah. And a particularly stark figure, almost all the women arrested, 34 out of 35 recorded, were Burakumin.
And the death sentences you mentioned earlier in Wakayama.
The sources explicitly state that the 2 men sentenced to death in Wakayama were from Burakumin communities. This really shows the deep and tragic intersection of economic hardship, protest, and pre-existing social discrimination and how the events unfolded and how justice or injustice was applied.
Did the government's response to the riots eventually include any acknowledgement or action regarding the plight of Buraku communities, given this disproportionate impact?
The sources note a delayed but, well, meaningful response from the new government that came into power after the riots. The Hara cabinet, formed following Terauchi's resignation, allocated funds for village improvement in 1920, and established social bureaus. The sources highlight this as the first time the Japanese state specifically spent money on improving conditions in Buraku communities, a direct, if late, consequence of the riots revealing that deep inequality.
Beyond the direct impact on the protesters and the major political shifts, there's a surprising, almost anecdotal, wider impact mentioned in the sources too, right?
Oh, you mean the cancellation of the National Middle School Baseball Tournament? Yes.
Yeah.
The sources note that the widespread unrest, particularly near the stadium in Kobe with the burning of Suzuki Shoten we talked about, made the security situation just too unstable. The tournament was first postponed and then ultimately canceled altogether.
Imagine that a major national sporting event shut down because people literally couldn't afford rice. But the biggest political consequence was obviously much more profound.
Absolutely. The sheer scale and intensity of the riots and the clear failure of the existing government to manage the crisis or the public anger directly forced the resignation of the Terauchi cabinet. It just couldn't survive this.
And this led to a really significant change in who held power.
It did. The elder statesman Saionji recommended Hara Takashi, the head of the Rikken Seiyukai party. And crucially, Hara became the first commoner, meaning not from the hereditary peerage, an elected politician to become Prime Minister of Japan.
Forming Japan's first real party cabinet, wasn't it?
Exactly. He was widely referred to as the commoner prime minister, and his appointment was a direct outcome of the social upheaval of the rice riots. It marked a pivotal shift towards party rule in Japanese politics, even if that path later faced challenges.
It's also clear from the sources that our understanding of these events, how they started and who was involved, has deepened over time.
Definitely. The sources trace the evolution of historical research, moving away from that single, maybe overly simple narrative of fishermen's wives in Uozu being the sole starting point.
Right.
Newer studies, supported by collected testimonies and local records cited in the sources, have revealed those earlier actions we discussed and really highlighted the connections to existing labor struggles and diverse urban working communities.
So the picture is much more complex and nuanced than it might have seemed initially.
Much more nuanced, yeah. It's now understood as a broad movement with multiple triggers and diverse participants, not just one spontaneous, isolated event. The sources even mention modern recognition, with memorial sites in Toyama acknowledging its significance today.
And its impact is still felt, or at least remembered, depicted in various ways culturally.
Yes. The sources note how the riots have been represented in culture over the years, from powerful paintings like Sakube Yamamoto's coal mine art, which directly captures that experience, to films and manga. It shows that this event continues to resonate and be remembered as a really critical moment in Japan's modern history.
We've really traversed the landscape of the 1918 rice riots using the sources you provided. From the economic pressures of the Taishō boom meeting wartime supply issues, to the devastating price hikes fueled by speculation, the government's ineffective responses, the diverse ways the protests ignited and spread from ports to cities to mines, the harsh suppression, the unfortunate layer of existing social discrimination that shaped the outcome for many, and the ultimate political earthquake that followed.
It's such a powerful illustration from history, isn't it? How something as fundamental as the cost of daily food can become the catalyst for nationwide unrest, revealing these deep underlying social tensions and even reshaping the political structure of a country.
Absolutely. And thinking about this event, where everyday struggles over something as basic as food could lead to such widespread unrest and ultimately real political change, what does that tell you about the relationship between economic hardship and the power, sometimes desperate power, of ordinary people's collective action? It's a connection that feels, well, surprisingly relevant, even looking back from over a century later.